So, good morning, all. Welcome back to the Turn It Round the Corner podcast. This is episode 20. Welcome, Steve Tongue, famed author, Leyton Orient fan, Leyton Orient walking football captain. Steve, how you doing?
Very good, thanks, Christian. A little bit weary after this morning's walking football session, but lovely to get out there in the sunshine for once, which was amazing.
Yeah, lovely day today. So good on you. We're gonna get to the walking football a little bit later in the podcast because, as I say, I'm very interested in something that seems to have massively grown over the last couple of years. And as I say, I was at a sporting venue the other day, and we was talking about our local club here, Lee Ramblers, and the chairman was like, "Yeah, there's 50 guys now this morning playing walking football, and it seems to be something that's really growing as a participation sport, and obviously, I suppose, an extension to being able to play football and carry that on, but." Really, I want to start with your work at the BBC. So, you worked at the BBC, Steve, for, was it 40 years, 45 years?
It was a bit more varied than that.
Yeah.
When I first came out of college, 1973, commercial radio was just starting in this
Right.
country, and LBC, originally called London Broadcasting, was
Yeah.
just starting up. Needed a sports reporter all of a sudden. So I thought, well, why not? I'd not done much radio, but I effectively went in as the football correspondent right from the start. So from day one, I pretty much had my choice of which match to go to in London every Saturday.
Yeah.
And then as it grew, we started doing broadcasts for all the other commercial stations that came on. People in their local area will know their local stations now. Capital Radio was the second one in London that started, and then Piccadilly in Manchester and Radio City in Liverpool. It grew all over the country. And of course, they all wanted football commentary and so on. They all wanted contracts with their local clubs, and most developed very good relationships with their local clubs who realised the publicity they could get. So
Sure.
I did that for 13 years. Went to the 1986 World Cup, which was very exciting in
Ah,
Mexico,
brilliant.
and then started on a succession of newspapers, some of which lasted, some of which didn't. Robert Maxwell tried to start a new paper called the London Daily News in the capital as a big rival to the Evening Standard, which had a monopoly at that time, and didn't really take off. The Standard played real hardball and wouldn't let their sellers sell the new paper and so on. It was
Right.
quite an interesting insight into the ruthless business of journalism and newspapers. So I ended up doing some freelance spells, then went to the BBC in the early 90s until the 1994 World Cup in the USA, which was another great trip.
Did you go to
Um,
that, Steve?
the US at the BBC Radio 5 and the US World Cup in 94.
Wow.
Um, and then various freelancing jobs, and ended up at the Independent from 2000 until about 2013 when they brought in some cuts. And I thought, I'm going to have to step aside, and maybe I'll start writing some books. So I did that.
Steve, just before we get onto that, how you mentioned Capital Radio then, was that 1548? Because you
It
invoked,
was well
you,
remembered.
yeah, you invoked my childhood then, long before, like, I suppose we're both showing our age, but like long before Sky and satellite radio. I just remember midweek games in my bedroom listening to Jonathan Pierce on 1548, and like just how excited he'd get, and obviously he'd go around the grounds, but it'd always be like the big London game of the day. So you mentioned there that you went to two World Cups, Steve. How was that? Was that you was commentating? Obviously, '94 England didn't get there, but was that just commentating on every game, or was that obviously
No,
the '86 UK England specific, or how did like go into a World Cup working for the BBC work?
I was actually, well, my first two were for commercial radio. I was still at LBC,
Right.
82 in Spain and 86. And I would normally, I would go with England, basically.
Okay.
Um, those groups, depending how big the country is, of course, some of the smaller ones you can get around. But really, if you're covering a team like England, you've got to be with them all the time because there's always going to be press conferences, there are going to be
Sure.
news stories. Brian Robson suddenly dislocated his shoulder again and might have to come home and all that sort of stuff,
Yeah.
which was very much the story in at least one of those. So you go to the press conferences, you go to the matches, and normally you can go to the other matches in the group, which in those days I think it was a bit more sensible. A group would be based on two venues, and so you
Sure.
you could go to one fairly close, and then you would go to the next. I remember you would often even go along with the manager and the coaches. I remember in where are we now? 1990 in Italy. There was a terrible first game, which people may remember, between England and Ireland, finished up
Yeah.
1-1 in
One
terrible
all.
gusty conditions, which really ruined the game. And Bobby Robson was furious with the press because everyone had written what a terrible game it was. I think the Sun actually wrote an editorial saying "Bring them home" after one game, which was a bit harsh.
Was that the
So
Kevin
Bobby had a
Sheedy? I
very
can't remember. I remember actually. Did Lineker stab on it? Was that a Kevin Sheedy power driver in
Yes,
that
that's
game to
right. That's
equalise?
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So Bobby had a very cross press conference, and then being Bobby, he was next minute he was good as gold, and we all jumped on a little plane, the smallest plane I've ever been in, which I wasn't very thrilled with, and we got on the. We were in Cagliari, of course, in Sardinia, and the next group game, which was Holland against Egypt, was. Down on the other island. So we hopped over there with Bobby and Don Howe, and they both calmed down a bit and went to watch the next group game, and then flew back with them. So yeah, it was lovely. You got in those days, as everyone who works in football journalism will know. The further back you go, the easier it was to get on with the players and the managers. You had their home phone numbers in the days before mobiles, and they didn't actually mind you ringing them up. Whereas I doubt that too many people have got the home phone numbers of all the top managers these days. And they're expected just to talk to the press when there's official press conferences from the club and so on. So yeah, it was they were both great tournaments. In '94 in the US, I was actually attached to the Republic of Ireland because I covered them in some ways more than England in
Right.
the much of the time. It was great fun with Jack Charlton. Jack would always have a barrel of Guinness wherever he went in his hotel room, and he was always good mates with the press, except for the occasional explosion. So frequently, you'd be invited up in the evening to have a pint of Guinness with Jack. And the Irish were terrific fun. I always remember I went to the first press conference I'd ever been to with the Irish team. It was actually 1988 in the Euros in Germany. We went to the press conference, and the Irish press boys said to me, "You're coming back to the team hotel?" And I said, "What? We're allowed to go in the team hotel?" And they looked at me as if to say, "Yeah, why wouldn't journalists be allowed in the team hotel?" So we all went back to the team hotel, and the first thing I saw and heard was Liam Brady standing on the table leading the singing with all the fans and the families and everybody else, and a great evening session. But even at that time, you didn't get that with England. You wouldn't go into
Uh,
the England hotel and find anybody standing on the table singing. So the Irish were great fun, and I actually followed them almost right through to the end of Mick McCarthy's time in the early 2000s when I went back to the Independent. But the World Cups, of course, were the highlight and the peak. Hard work, but great fun and a great privilege to be there, of course.
So you just mentioned there was always some great stories to come out of that World Cup with Ireland. The various books and podcasts I've read, that there seems to be a lot of fun around that team. As you say, they played hard on the pitch, but they also, I think, partied quite hard after and enjoyed themselves and the occasion. But what about the like being around the team with Bobby Robson and England? Like he's probably one of my favourite England managers. I know he's probably before a lot of people's time, but I would say one of my heroes. Italian '90 World Cup, probably my favourite World Cup of all time. And growing up, I was just about to start senior school, etc. Massive fond memories. Even my most of my memorabilia that I collect. It all started with the Italian '90 World Cup. What can you tell me about Bobby Robson? Like, is he? Is he a nicer bloke as just everyone always says? Have you got any specific like stories from that World Cup with Bobby?
Well, what people forget, of course, is that a couple of years before it, he was under pressure. I
Well,
mean,
everyone, even the start of that tournament, Steve, wasn't he? He was
yes,
under pressure.
yeah,
People wanted him out. Where
yeah.
was he going after? Was he going? He'd already agreed. Had he agreed to go Barcelona
Yes,
after?
with
But yeah,
Barcelona, yeah,
yeah,
yeah. Purely because he thought he wasn't getting the support that he should have had from the FA, and the
yeah,
FA really were left with egg on their face because they'd had a manager who was effectively one penalty shootout away from winning the World Cup. Because I
yeah,
think we would have, if you remember, Argentina had a decimated team by the
yeah.
final. About half of them had been suspended. They had injuries as well, and they really had Maradona left, and that was it, which is why it was such a tame final against
Final was
West
terrible, wasn't
Germany.
it, Steve?
Yeah.
That Bremer penalty, wasn't it? Bottom
Yeah,
right. Yeah,
Germany were always going to win it, and Argentina. I'm sure we would have beaten Argentina. So we could have had a bloke who became the second England manager ever to win the World Cup, and suddenly the FA had lost him because they had allowed him to go off to Barcelona. Anyway, as I say, he was under pressure going into the 2 years before. One personal story, which I'm sure Harry Harris was an old journalist friend of mine. We were actually rivals on the local papers in Walthamstow years ago. And I'm sure he won't mind me telling the story. We went to Glasgow and England got beaten 1-0. So this is probably about 87. It wasn't a bad defeat, but it wasn't great. It was just one of those where Scotland had been the better team. We touched down at Heathrow coming back, and Harry was such an important, he'd become the main Daily Mirror football writer. And he was such an important bloke that in those days he had a mobile phone, which was amazing. None of us had ever seen a mobile phone, let alone got one. And as we touched down at Heathrow and were walking through the baggage and so on, his phone went. And there was a long conversation, well, a long conversation in which Harry took very little part. He was very quiet, which was unlike him. And when he got off the phone, he said, that was Maxwell, of course, Robert Maxwell, who owned the Daily Mirror. I said, blimey, what did he want? He said, he wants me to write, Robson must go. And I said, wow, what are you going to do? And he looked at me as if I was mad. He said, what do you think I'm going to do? I'm going to write Robson must go. And so, of course, on Monday morning, the back page of the Daily Mirror was enough, Bobby, Robson must go, blah, blah, blah. And within, as you say, 2 or 3 years from that, we very nearly won the World Cup. But of course, that sort of thing, managers, however thick-skinned they are, they don't just allow that stuff to wash over them, most of them. I mean, Graham Taylor got a lot of stick and he tried not to show it, but I know it took him, he took it very personally. One of my best ever interviews, nothing to do with me, but just because he spoke so well, was a very long interview with him after he'd finished with England and Villa and Wolves, and he was briefly back at Watford, and he really sort of poured his heart out
yeah,
about the abuse he'd got from the press and the Sun in particular, turning him to a turnip and that stuff. That really got to him. But to go back to the answer to your question, as I expect you anticipated, is no, Bobby was a lovely man, but like any other manager, he knew when to get angry with his players, and there were
yeah.
occasions when he got angry with the press as well, and some of it I have to say was justified.
Yeah, I think, like to your point, I think I remember watching that, or I've seen it since, Steve, around the Graham Taylor, and you could tell that it really affected him. I think the same for Bobby, like reading a lot of autobiographies and reading, things about him and that World Cup, and like watching things as well. Like I think that really affected him, like because yeah, it was probably his the job that he'd always wanted, and he'd got it. And as you say, he was a penalty kick away from the World Cup final. Yet really, he'd taken a job at Barcelona because he thought he was going to get forced out. It was quite sad in a way, really, because just he always just come across as such a lovely bloke, and a true gentleman. As you say, obviously there's times when I'm sure he was difficult and had a temper like any other manager, but I'd say 99% of the time he just seemed such a lovely man. And did you just see how well he's respected still in football and at Newcastle and everywhere else? That I think, yeah, it was just a real shame how that played out. So Steve, thanks for that. That's like amazing that you got to live those experiences and got to see World Cups not only with England but other countries as well, and go to other games. So you said you'd come out of the of radio and press in 2013, Steve. So talk to me about how you thought about writing books, because as I say, your newest book, would probably best start at your newest book, but then if we could work back on how you got to it. So Steve, talk to me about the newest book that you've just released in September of last year, if you don't mind, please.
Yes, it's become a series, in
Yeah,
fact. It started off as Turf Wars, which was a history of London football. They always say when you're writing, try to write about what you know. And I was
yeah,
keen to do a book. I thought, well, if I know anything about anything, it's probably London football as much as anything else. And so it became, it's not, I hope, just a history of the clubs, that one. It's about football in the area as well. So, and all the books the ones I've done, there are four so far, they are always about an area which has particular importance to football. So the London one, obviously, you had the start of the Football Association, and from that, the FA Cup and England internationals and so on. So London was important for that. Then the second one I did was it was called Lancashire. It's basically the Northwest teams,
yeah,
so not just Manchester and Merseyside, but all the smaller. We always do all the smaller clubs as well. And Lancashire, of course, was very important for two big things. The start of professionalism, when basically all these players were coming down from Scotland and clearly being paid when they shouldn't have done, or being found a nice job, which they didn't have to do too much work at. So Lancashire was very important. And then the third one I did was on the West Midlands, because when the Football League started after professionalism, of course, people remember the first 12 clubs in the original Football League were half a dozen from Lancashire and half a dozen from the Midlands. So those areas were both important. And then this most recent one that you mentioned, which is called Yorkshire Turf Wars. Yorkshire is very important for the origins of club football in this country, because Sheffield FC,
yeah,
nothing to do with Wednesday or United, but a team that remained virtually amateur almost all the time. Sheffield FC can claim to be the first independent football club in the world, let alone in England. There are one or two places like Cambridge University which say, oh, we had the first football club. But it's always agreed that because they were just part, it was just a football club as part of a different sort of institution, that Sheffield have the FIFA acknowledgement as the world's oldest football club. And within a couple of years, people always say, well, if they were the oldest football club, who did they play? And for a while, they did just play matches amongst themselves. But within a couple of years, they had some big rivals called Hallam,
yeah.
who they still play once a year. And that
It's
was the
funny, Steve.
first official match, the first official competition then came out of it, and so on. So Yorkshire was important for the origins, as well as all those clubs subsequently.
It's funny you say that, Stephen. Sorry to cut in. Like, I'm a bit of a football geek, so I was watching a series the other day about like football rivalries, and there was a recent game, I think maybe a couple of weeks ago, where Sheffield FC played Hallam, and there was a couple of thousand there. I think they're step six now or whatever they are. Like it was quite low down the pyramid, but like it's very much ranked on like groundhoppers that's one of the famed derby and places to go to.
Oh yeah, they will. I mean, and amazing really that Sheffield have kept going. I mean, we're talking 1857, so I can't do the maths on top of my head,
Yeah,
but that's a long time.
yeah.
They've rightly celebrated the 100th anniversary. They get big knobs from FIFA turn up and so on, and the 150th anniversary. Actually, I can do that. The 150th. Comparatively recently, but no, it's amazing, and they were resolutely amateur. They refused ever to turn professional, which was one of the reasons why Sheffield Wednesday and then Sheffield United were able to start up, because there were no great rivals to them as local professional clubs. So yeah, in Yorkshire, of course you've got Leeds and the two Sheffield clubs, and then Huddersfield. One of the things I do in all these books is I work out which team in the area has finished highest up the pyramid, as it is, although normally it's the top division
Right.
in each area. And so what you find I mean, if you had a guess, you'd probably say Leeds and the two Sheffield clubs. And you'd be right because the times they've finished as top Yorkshire club is Leeds 38 seasons, Sheffield Wednesday 32, Sheffield United 20, and Huddersfield 18. And
Yeah.
what you find is that's very similar in all the books. And one of the themes of the books I always say is that although it's a bit pessimistic, you might think I've always said that big clubs basically stay big and small clubs unfortunately tend to stay small. In London, it's even more one-sided in that the top London team every year since a London team got into the league is Arsenal 58, Tottenham 21, Chelsea 20, and the rest basically are nowhere. And one of the points I made in the original London book was that by about 1920, say after the First World War, once football got going again, the big three clubs in London were undoubtedly Arsenal, Tottenham, and Chelsea. And West Ham, if you remember, reached the FA Cup final in 1923, the first famous Wembley final. West Ham were always trying to be that fourth club. And of course, if you go on 100 years, 2020, or even today, I think everyone would agree the top London clubs are still Arsenal, Tottenham, and Chelsea. And West Ham are still trying to be that, that number four, and haven't yet quite got up with the top three. So it's a slightly I say it's slightly pessimistic in a way to say, oh, the big clubs will always be big and the small clubs will always be small, because the other theme of all the books is that every club, as we know, whichever club you support, you'll know that club has its ups and downs, even in the
Yeah.
course of 1 or 2 seasons. So I just think it's very hard, and it's become harder. That's the other thing I would definitely say, that it's become harder for the smaller clubs to get up there. I mean, one of the great triumphs of my football supporting life was I was 11 years old when Leyton Orient somehow got into the top division along with Liverpool.
Yeah.
And Leyton Orient have got there, and people can name the other teams like Carlisle and Swindon and Northampton and the old Wimbledon who got into the top division. But I think you'd probably agree with me that the chances of any club of that level doing that again and actually getting into the Premier League have diminished considerably, which is a great shame in a way.
Is that because Steve? Do they go hand in hand? Is that size of the club and obviously the footfall of that and where they are and the people and I suppose supporting that and money, or
Yeah,
is it? Would you
it's
say
largely
money?
money,
Yeah,
money and resources. I mean, there were
yeah,
two or three very important changes. One, if you remember, in the 1980s, I don't remember the exact date, but when the Football League clubs used to get together, and there was all, if you remember, before the Premier League, the top clubs in the Football League were always very keen to get more share of the money, basically the
sure.
TV money or whatever money, and that's why we ended up with the Premier League. But there was a very important ruling when, until I would say the early, if not mid 80s, the home club used to split the gate receipts with the away club. And so if you were away to Manchester United or Arsenal or Tottenham or whoever, you got a decent split of the gate money,
Sorry,
which of
Steve. When
course
was that? Just as a normal fixture, or?
early to middle 80s.
Oh, I didn't know that. I thought that had
Yeah.
just always been an
And
FA Cup thing.
yeah, no, and round about that time, the it was decided at the Football League AGM that the home club would keep all their gate receipts, which was, of
Right.
course, a huge advantage to those sort of clubs I mentioned. So the clubs with the biggest crowds in every division kept their money, and the clubs who were struggling on small attendances kept theirs, which was just a pittance of what they would have got from a big away game. So that was one of the very big changes. Um, People, if you went even further back, people would say the abolition of the maximum wage in about 1961 was another big
Yeah.
factor in that suddenly players the big clubs could offer the big money, and we've seen the effects of that. So yes, it's largely economic things. I can't think of a club that's been a big club in my time. Of course, they get relegated. I mean, I'm so ancient. I've seen Manchester United play in the second division for a season.
Yeah.
I've seen Tottenham and Chelsea relegated and so on. I think the only clubs since I started looking at the league tables who've actually stayed in the top division all that time are probably Arsenal and Everton. I mean, even Liverpool, as I say, went up with Orient. They were a second division team when I started looking at the football results, and they went up with Orient in 1962 and they stayed there. But the other thing, of course, the biggest, most recent development is with a Chelsea and then a Manchester City and
Yeah.
then a Newcastle when the really big money comes in, and that's going to help them, and that's going to help them. Basically, if you stay at the top long enough, then you should be able to stay at the top because I think even if whoever's back in the club at that level, even if they suddenly drop out or get financial problems. And we know we've seen Chelsea sort of change hands, for instance. Manchester City are facing all these financial problems. But whatever happens to them, I think they've been at the top now long enough and they've got enough money that they're not going to sink down and really go through back into the third division like City did and so on. So I say it's a bit sad, but there's still hope. You know, we all start the new season thinking maybe our team can do better this year, and if we can just get the signing, and you know, you and I see a lot of Leyton Orient, and we can see, I think, what an inspirational manager can do when he comes in. A manager who clearly is very good at a certain level and can improve the team even with comparatively little resources, and what good sound management by good sound owners can do. But then again, if we look at Orient, just to take one small example, we know they really need a bigger ground, and the kind of amounts of money needed to find and finance a complete new stadium are a very big deal indeed. So say it's a shame, but we all live in hope, don't we? We all know there's another game on Saturday, and who knows where we'll go from there.
What did your findings say, Steve, in regard to like the outliers? I'm trying to think like when you were explaining that to me about teams staying in the top division and the money attached. What would you say about teams like an Oldham that maybe have been on? I think it was for a few years, but were a Premier League club and now playing in the conference.
Yeah, I think I would say they were overachieving.
Right.
I mean, go back far enough, and those sort of clubs have all got a history. I mean, remember
Sure.
Bury, who younger
Yeah. Yeah.
listeners probably won't even know as a football team. Bury won the FA Cup. Oldham should actually have won the Football League. I think from memory, it's the season before the First World War when they were runners up and they messed up the last couple of games. So, you know, in those days everybody had a chance. That's what you feel. And even much more recently, I mean, I remember if you look at the list of league champions in, say, the late 60s and early 70s, there was a run of about 7 seasons when there was a different team won the league every year,
Yeah.
and teams
Yeah.
like Ipswich and Derby were winning it, and then Forest came along as well with Brian Clough's amazing achievements with them. So really, the other thing I would say, and it's slightly controversial, is that I think every team has a basic sort of level.
Yeah.
Um, and if we use, you know, again, our own example, I would say Orient now are let's hope, top of the third tier
Yeah,
team.
I'd say we're definitely a League One club. Like
Yeah,
anything above like a championship probably would be in our greatest dreams. But I tend to think we're a bit bigger and better than League Two.
yeah, and it's a very interesting exercise for anybody who's listening. If you care to write down who you think are the 20 biggest clubs in the country, and
Yeah,
by biggest clubs, I tend to mean attendance, resources, history, what they've won, and the potential they've got. And undoubtedly, it's never the case that those are the 20 teams in the Premier League because it changes. I don't think anybody would say Brentford, Bournemouth, Brighton are
no,
the 20 biggest clubs in the country
no,
when you've got teams like Leeds, even Sunderland, Middlesbrough,
yeah,
who are not there and haven't been there for a while. But you always feel that I mean, it's an inspiration in a way how well those teams have done. Brentford, Bournemouth, Brighton. I mean, again, I think I would say when I started looking at league tables, every one of those would have been in the third division south, I think,
mm,
along with people like Ipswich. So they can move up. The other thing about that, I would say, is that the teams who tended to do that are the ones in the southeast which is tied up with economy and national economics as much as anything else. If you look at teams who've dropped out of the league, there's an awful lot from the northeast, just sort of Workington, Hartlepool, Barrow, northeast and northwest, Carlisle, who've all ended up going out of the league altogether and faced a struggle. Whereas it's the slightly more prosperous economically southern and southeastern teams who've become gone up the ladder. But I don't know. I think you probably agree that somebody like Bournemouth, they're overachieving as well, and that they've been able to do it, as we know, on the back of very good financial backing. Um, what happens to them when their financial backer moves on, decides he's had enough is another question. That's the one thing I didn't mention about those big owners who come in, and you've seen it at a lot of local non-league clubs, I'm sure, that somebody who's got some money comes into the club and is very interested for a year or two, and
Yeah.
then realizes how much money he's losing and how much stick he's getting from the fans, and thinks I've had enough of that, and the club can then be in serious difficulties, can't they?
Yeah, exactly that. So, Steve, in regards to your latest book, do you wanna just give I suppose, a bigger overview than we've just touched on it in regards to the series? Do you just wanna give a little plug for the book?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the thing, it wasn't a great time to bring out a book about Yorkshire because, of course, with Sheffield United
Sure.
relegated last season, there's not a single Yorkshire team in the Premier League. Um, what I've said was that I mean, that these things go up and go down. I'm a bit surprised and a little bit disappointed for Sheffield Wednesday because that feels like a big club to me,
Yeah.
and they're underachieving. When I've said most teams seem to have a level that they should be at, I think that those are ones who are underachieving. Fortunately, from my point of view, I see Leeds and Sheffield United both doing well.
I think
Uh,
they both go back up, you think,
yeah,
Steve?
you would have thought so.
Yeah.
And to be honest, I think what I've said about the top 20 teams in the country, they would possibly be in there. Sheffield United might be on the borderline. Um, but no, it's an interesting football area. I think I had a statistic in the introduction that for about the first, yes, from once Sheffield Wednesday were the first Yorkshire team to get into the Football League. That was just before 1900. And there was a Yorkshire team then at the top in the top division for the next 90 years until Leeds finally got relegated. What the other interesting thing about the area is the number of teams who go up and go down. I saw a statistic once about which clubs have been promoted and relegated most times. It was surprising. It was somebody like Grimsby who'd been up and down most. But of course,
Really?
the one that's happened recently is Rotherham, who for that
Yeah.
amazing, 6 or 7 years
Yeah.
just went up and down and up and down.
Yeah.
And I suppose their supporters got used to it. And because they had about 3 promotions in that time, as well as the relegations, they probably enjoyed it for quite a while. But the other thing is all the places I've written about. I think you would say are good football areas,
Yeah.
London, the Midlands, Lancashire, and Yorkshire. If I was to do another book, I think the only one really that probably merits it is the Northeast,
Yeah.
um, with Newcastle and Sheffield, Newcastle and Sunderland and Middlesbrough. I deliberately didn't put Middlesbrough in the Yorkshire book, although they are technically right in on the edge of North
Yeah.
Yorkshire. But I always think of Middlesbrough as a very much a northeastern club rather than a Yorkshire club.
Yeah.
So yeah, I hope it will sell a few. The London one, in fact, has been by far the best seller.
Yeah.
And what I'm working on at the moment is revising it because it came out I was surprised to realise in 2016.
Right.
And so I like to take at least 2 years to do all of them. So if I do a revised copy in 2026, that will be 10 years. And in 10 years, people like Spurs and Chelsea in particular have had an awful lot of managers, and an awful lot's gone on in London football,
Yeah.
as well, including, of course, our own club, the Orient.
Yeah.
So there's been a lot more ups and downs. And the other thing I do in each of the books, I do a section on non-league clubs. And what I didn't do in the original London one, I didn't have a section on women's football, but it's now
Right.
become so big that I've been looking at the history of women's football in London, which is quite interesting because it mirrors the story of women's football generally, in that it was very much once the FA finally decided in the early 70s that women could actually be allowed to play football again and took it under their umbrella. It was very much just little local clubs like, a Golden Girls team
Yeah,
from Spurs or Orient or somewhere would enter a competition, and then there were the Friends of Fulham and the Millwall Lionesses, but none of them were actually attached to professional clubs. And then once Arsenal were really the leaders in becoming attached to their club, and once the big professional clubs like Arsenal, and then later Tottenham and Chelsea and Manchester City, and eventually Manchester United, who were very slow, once they took a women's team into house, as it were, and put some money into it, this is actually, I've just realised, this is the first ever season where all the teams in the Women's Super League are connected with a team in the men's Premier League. There were one or two like Lincoln and somebody else who got relegated. Teams like Yeovil, were doing quite well for a while. But now, because all the big Premier League clubs are putting money into it, it's become a mirror of the men's Premier League, that the ones with the most money tend to do best. And
sure.
so, not surprisingly, we've got Arsenal and Chelsea as the main women's teams in London, and Manchester City and Manchester United up north. So it's beginning to reflect the men's game, but it seems important to write about them and the history of it. As I say, is actually particularly interesting, the women's game and the way it was banned in the 1920s and then took 50 years to get back and so on.
Definitely massively growing, isn't it, Steve? As you say, just even from a exposure and the TV perspective, it's definitely massively growing. I think obviously the success of the English national team over here has done wonders for it. Have you ever thought about, Steve, doing a non-league book or a London non-league, like just focused on non-league, or is that, I suppose, where do you start with that?
Yes, I mean, the story of the non-league is even more so than the professional club. What you found with the professional clubs in the early days was there used to be a lot of mergers, and a lot would disband and so on, and then
Yeah,
start up again. And of course, we've seen a lot of that in non-league. I mean, when I was a lad, my dad, as well as taking me to Leyton Orient, used to take me to Walthamstow Avenue, who were one of the Premier non-league teams.
sure.
All the Southeast teams, of course, tended to be in the Isthmian League or the Athenian League, but the Avenue won the Amateur Cup a couple of times. Had a very famous game, which I did write about in the London book, where they played drawn away to Manchester United in the FA Cup. This is the early 50s. Got a 1-1 draw at Old Trafford, and
Wow.
came back for the replay in London, very sensibly decided that Walthamstow Avenue, which was a lovely little ground called Green Pond Road, wasn't quite big enough to host Manchester United. So they played it at Highbury with a huge crowd, about 40,000, and United came through about 5-2. But what's interesting about that team had two England cricketers, Trevor Bailey and Doug Insole, both in the Walthamstow Avenue team in the days when people could play football and cricket all year round, and had a couple of players who then did turn professional. Of course, it always used to be said that the term shamateurism, that it was, if you had a decent job, you might as well stay as an amateur player, because with the money you got in your boots on a Saturday
Yeah,
afternoon, you could get more money than you could with the £20 maximum wage that applied as a professional. But a couple of those players from Walthamstow Avenue, from that team, did go on to join Chelsea, and played in the Chelsea side, which won the Football League for the first time ever in the mid 50s. Another thing that some of our younger listeners may not remember in that was that Chelsea weren't always a huge club. Although I said they were one of the biggest in London, they didn't actually win the league till 1955, which to me still seems comparatively recent. Anything in the last 50 or 60 years, I think, oh yes, I remember that. That must be quite recent, though it's not quite the case. But no, the of course the Avenue, who I mentioned, then became a part of Leytonstone. They linked up with
yeah. Leighton
Leytonstone,
Pennant.
and then Leytonstone Ilford, and
Yeah,
then Redbridge, Forest, and eventually Dagenham and Redbridge, which
yeah.
is so that's one of the ways you can get into the Football League, and one of the ways in which the teams come and go, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly. But you've just imparted another bit of knowledge on me, Steve. That Bailey played football. I didn't know that either. He was like the original chairman and played for my boys' cricket club, so Westcliff-on-Sea. So his picture is like adorned everywhere in the clubhouse and stuff. So
Oh,
another
that's amazing.
another thing that you've taught me. So Steve, aside from like your Turf War series, you actually wrote a book on David Beckham as well, right? 50 Defining Fixtures. Do you want to tell me about that?
Yeah, that was the first one I wrote. What I've said, I finished newspapers in 2013, and I was always been great admiration for any journalist before that who managed to write a book while they were still working full time for a newspaper. I just used to think, how on earth they find the time to do that?
Sure.
So when I stopped, I was still doing a bit of freelance work elsewhere. But I thought, well, if I'm ever going to write any books about football, this is the time to do it. And I'd always been had a particular interest in David Beckham, partly for the sort of local connections. He was brought up locally, Leytonstone and Chingford,
Yeah.
which was very much my sort of manner, and born in Whipps Cross Hospital, which was my family's local hospital that we'd always go to. So I knew all the schools he'd been to and the places he'd lived and so on. And when he started playing, I was just pure coincidence, really. I was working at the BBC and I happened to be at the game where he made his debut for Manchester United, which was a League Cup game down at Brighton. He came on as a sub for the first time. So I felt I was kind of in at the beginning. And then I was covering England by the time he started playing regularly for them and was actually quite impressed. I remember going to his first press conference and I thought, as England captain, which is quite a big deal because there's a lot of people there and all the cameras are on you and waiting for you to make a
Was
mistake and
that
whatever.
was that
And
Italy, Steve? Was that Italy under Peter Taylor? Was that
I
right?
think it probably was. It was at Pride Park at Derby. I remember going up
Right.
there for the press conference, and I thought he's actually spoken very well there, and just the right sort of touch of lightness and sincerity and so on. Because if you remember, around about that time, there were a lot of jokes about David Beckham and
Yeah.
how thick he supposedly was.
Yeah.
And I thought that's a bit unfair. So yeah, I followed his career with great interest. And the whole kind of cultural phenomenon that grew up around him. What I did for the start of the book, in the introduction, I put three quotes. One of them was from Nelson Mandela, who said, "Oh, David Beckham is much more famous than me." The other one was from David himself, who said, "It's like the Truman Show." I don't know if people remember the film The
Yeah.
Truman Show, which is
Yeah.
about a bloke who doesn't realize that he's being filmed 24 hours a day and people can go online and watch him 24 hours a day and he doesn't know it's happening. And Beckham said he felt a bit like that bloke. And the third one was from a journalist I worked with called Jim Lawton, very experienced journalist, who wasn't a fan at all. Jim Lawton said, described him as the most overrated player in the history of the game, which I thought was a bit harsh. Um, but it's actually that's an interesting one for people to think about. Who's the most overrated player, you think? And I thought it was unfair. I mean, I thought he was a terrific player in that position, and still, I think any player who plays out wide and puts in a decent cross, you say, "Wow, that was almost like David Beckham or whatever." And just his work rate. I mean, one of the early themes of his early days. I started the book with, as you say, it was 50 fixtures, and the first couple were very early youth games for Manchester United, right up to his very last game for PSG when he retired. And everyone who speaks about him from those early days emphasizes how obsessive he was about practice. And
Yeah.
even in his England days and Manchester United days, how long he would stay behind just practicing those free kicks and whipping in those crosses. He really was one of those for whom, practice makes perfect and was a terrific worker. So I've always admired him more than most people, certainly more than good old Jim Lawton. And I've really always wished him well.
Yeah, Steve, I used to have this conversation. So my dad would always like again probably not be as amazed with Beckham as I was. He always used to say, "I'll get my boots out the loft. I could cross it like him, and so on and so forth." But to your point, good friend of mine, Luke Young, obviously come through at Spurs and played for a number of London clubs, including your wife supports Charlton, and he said he got a little run in the England team. I think when Neville was injured in one of the European qualifying campaigns. I think it's when we had Northern Ireland and Wales in our group.
Right,
Um,
yeah.
but he said I can't remember who they played, but they had a very light training session. It was either the day before or the morning of the game. Excuse me. All the players got back on the coach, and it was all the players apart from Beckham. And he said like he took a bag of like 50 or 100 balls. Excuse me, and he just practiced free kicks for half an hour, and no one on the coach moved, no one complained, and everyone was like in awe that he put like 49 out of the 50 balls in the top corner. Like, and anyone anyone who did that in their career and bettered themselves and made the best of their abilities, similar to Frank Lampard, like they always had my massive respect. And I just think Beckham just become a global superstar, right?
Yeah, I think it was slightly little bit of a generational thing. I mean, Jim Lawton's a little bit older than me and started out, and there were people of that generation who resented the some of the off-field stuff and the haircuts and whatever, and allowed that to detract, I think, from their opinion of him as a player, which it shouldn't do. And that dedication that we both mentioned, that started at a very early age. I mean, whenever he got home from school, all he wanted to do was get out in the park in Chingford, and his dad was a very big factor in that as well. His dad would be home early from work and get him out there, and was a very hard taskmaster. Ted Beckham was on at him all the time. I think he was the bad cop, and David's mum was the good cop who would say, "You're being too harsh on him. Give him a chance, and he's doing great," and all the rest of it. And Ted, of course, was the reason that David became a Manchester United supporter and not a
Yeah.
Spurs supporter, because Ted was one of the generation who lived through the Munich air crash 1958, and was attracted to Manchester United, as a lot of people I found in London were, just because of that terrible tragedy, and became a United fan. And it was installed in David from a very early age that although London through and through in many ways, he was at Man United and not Tottenham or anybody else.
Yeah, exactly. I just think he made the best out of, you know, what he had. And obviously there were a few things obviously off the pitch that I thought, yeah, that's probably not the best, but ultimately it's what you do on the pitch, right? And I think he just gave everything in every game, and yeah, just made the best of everything he had. And probably now I don't think you can really name a better crosser than him. He was a right winger really that had no pace, not a massive amount of skill, but could literally drop it on a sixpence from literally anywhere, right? So yeah, great player. So Steve, anything else you wanna cover in regards to your books? You probably wrote, is it six or seven now? More than that?
Yes, four of the
Turf
Turf
Wars.
Wars books and the David Beckham. As I say, don't know whether there'll be another one in the series, but it
Yeah.
probably ought to be the Northeast if we do. But I look forward to revising the London one and bringing that up to date.
Have you ever been tempted, Steve, with your close ties to Charlton or Orient? I know there's been a few books written on Leighton Orient recently. Have you ever been tempted to do one of those London clubs on their own?
With the Orient one was a great story, of course, the recent years.
Yeah,
But Simon Cooper, who I know you've had on the pod,
yeah, brilliant
I
book.
think did a great job on that. It was
Yeah,
a classic story. I mean, what does he call it? The rise and the no, the fall and rise of
yeah,
Leighton Orient.
yeah,
Any club that suffers that badly and then rises again, I think, is an inspiration. And what I said about the ups and downs, any club that can do what they've done does make a great story. And yes, Simon told that very well. And in some ways, Charlton were similar, and they've had
yeah,
terrific ups and downs. I always remember my boy when he was about 4 years old. He said, "How do people decide what team to support?" And I said, "Well, you either support your family team, that's Leighton Orient, or you
yeah,
support the place where you live, and that's Charlton." And I think even at that age, he was able to look at the league tables, and this we're talking sort of late 80s now, sorry, late 70s, and decide that Charlton might be the better bet. And of course, he and my wife, who, as you say, goes down there, were rewarded with 9 seasons in the Premier League.
yeah.
But then, it fell apart for Charlton, and they're now right literally at the same level as Orient. That's how it goes, and that's one of the fascinations, and that's one of the great interests of writing these particular books, to chart the ups and downs of all these clubs.
Has there been a lot of books on the story of Charlton, Steve, about coming away from the valley and coming back there and
Yes, there's been one or two. There's a very
Right.
good lad, a friend of mine, who's the son of Pat Collins. Pat Collins was a very good all-round sports journalist for the Mail on Sunday, um, and his son wrote a very good one. I think it was called Valley of Despair or something similar. If I turn around, I'll probably see it on my bookshelf. But that was a similar story. Of course, we were because we've lived in Charlton for 40 odd years now. We were very involved in that. I remember my two boys going down to the valley one Sunday afternoon when it was an absolute wreck. The weeds had grown over all the terraces, and there'd been an appeal to come and clear the ground and tidy it up a bit. And we all went down there with our brooms and spades. But that was a good few years before they actually got back because they had to share at Selhurst, and then of
Yeah.
course people forget they had a year at Upton Park. But to come back and do what they did, coming back, I think the capacity was about 12,000 when they got back, and both teams were changing in porter cabins and
Water
stuff.
cabins,
And
yeah.
they had to sell people like Robert Lee just to finance coming back to the Valley, and so for them to get in the Premier League, I was at their Wembley playoff final, the famous 4-4 against Sunderland when they got up for the first time, and that was a terrific day for them.
Yeah, it's taught me something else then, Steve. I always remember Charlton at Selhurst. I don't remember him being at West Ham at all. So again, that's a bit of knowledge there. So I appreciate all your insights to your books and your broadcasting career and obviously being the author. But I want to touch on as well about you playing walking football. So as we touched on at the start, walking football seems to be I suppose a variation of football that's growing massively. So just give me some insight. So you play for Leighton Orient, and are they in the Essex League? So, actually, scrape it back, Steve. How does walking football work? Like, because I've seen it, I've tried to play it once as maybe a little muck around, and it's really hard, right, to not run when you're playing football. So
It's
talk to me
very
about
hard and it's a
that.
nightmare for referees.
Right.
Uh, I mean, just go back to the actual basics. It's six-a-side,
Right.
uh, generally played with proper touch lines,
Yeah.
like normal five-a-side football. There's a goalkeeper's area that he can't come out of and nobody else can go in.
Okay.
Otherwise, mostly the same rules.
Overhead height, Steve, or under?
Yeah, head height, overhead height, kick-ins rather than throw-ins,
Yeah.
and the goalkeeper can put the ball down and play it out, but can also just throw it out. But the main problem with the rules has, as you say, is running. Um, the actual rule is that one part of one foot must be on the ground at all times. But if you even picture that in your head, that's quite difficult. To
Yeah.
be honest, one of the reasons that I try very hard never to argue with the referee about running is that I genuinely don't know if I've gone off too fast or not myself.
Yeah.
So if the referee says it's running, then I take it it's running, and that's an indirect free kick. But a very, very interesting new rule which has come in, I think will become a part of the game. It will certainly be in our Essex League next year. If there are four running offences by one team, not one player, four by one team, that
Yeah.
becomes a penalty to the other side.
Yeah. Bit like
And
the
you
ice
might,
hockey ice hockey rules. Yeah.
is
Too
it? All right,
too
I didn't
many
know that.
fouls.
Well,
Yeah.
you've taught me something there. And because walking football generally is a low-scoring game, because we tend to play 10 minutes each way and then play about three games on the day. So they're quite short games. They're quite low scoring, a lot of goalless draws. So in some ways, it is going to distort the matches. I mean, we just played three games amongst ourselves, or in this morning as we're speaking, and one of the games, the only goals were a penalty to each team, which came from those four offences. But it does have an effect because by the time the referees very sensibly tell you when you're up to three offences,
Yeah.
and they say the next one's a penalty, and your teammates are actually saying to you, right, let's calm down, let's stop, because they get understandably upset with each other if you suddenly concede a fourth one and a penalty with it, because it's one of those. I would say majority of penalties are scored unless the goalkeeper gets a bit lucky. So that will have an effect, and the referees love it. All the referees say this has had a great beneficial effect, and so I can see it. I can see it coming in. The actual rules are. It's unfortunately, I think it's one of the unfortunate things at the moment. It's a bit like boxing in that there are about three different governing bodies. Um, the FA, in my opinion, should take over the whole thing, and I
Why?
wouldn't be.
Why is there three, Steve?
Well, one start the people who claim to have started the sport not all that long ago, probably 20 years ago, less than 20 years ago, are called the Walking Football Association. And because they started it and they set it up and they started the competitions, I think it's fair to say that they've been, I think I can say, jealously guarding it a bit, and they've had negotiations with the Football Association at some stage, but they haven't ever been able to agree even about the absolute basic rules. So there's that bit of rivalry, and there's another organisation which was set up as well. So, for instance, last season there were literally three different national cup competitions. This season, one of the organisations has sensibly said they won't run a national cup, but we will still be taking part in two different cup competitions, one by the FA and one run by the Walking Football Association. But for me, walking football ticks all the boxes which the Football Association, the governing body of football in this country, are trying to work on. There's sort of health,
Yeah,
fitness, mental health, the team spirit, and and that sort of thing, the diversity of it. There a lot of games are actually mixed games with women, but women also have their own leagues as well. So the basic levels are over 50s for men and over 40s for women.
yeah,
We've just been invited literally this week to take part in a charity tournament at Billericay Town where we play a lot of matches of mixed teams.
right.
So I say all the things which the FA is trying to promote, fair play and discipline and respect for referees and all the rest of it. It's all covered in walking football, and it is growing very quick. I can understand that, as with any sport which grows very quickly, there will be problems, but it and growing internationally as well. I think in the end, I hope that it will all come under the banner of the Football
Sure.
Association, and we'll have one set of regulations for everything, and they can continue to promote it with all the resources that they've got.
So a couple of questions straight off the bat, then, Steve. Like this clamping down on running, like as I said to you, I've tried it a couple of times, and you just it's like muscle memory, right? Your brain's telling you, look, the ball's there, you need to run after it. So
Yeah,
clamping down on that is one thing, but like let's just say in standard football, like getting space, for instance, you might run someone away to come back short, for instance, that gives you 5 yards to turn and get a
yeah,
shot off or a pass.
yeah.
If they're going to clamp down on just straight up walking, how do you get away from someone like how I can just imagine that it's six aside, so you've got five players. Like the minute you touch it, someone would be right next to you, and I don't know how do you get away from someone? I don't.
Right. Well, the one thing I haven't mentioned is the rules on tackling.
Right,
Um, Generally, no tackling from behind or from the side.
right,
In the Essex League, and people may find this hard to understand, effectively, they do say there should be no tackling from the front. Now, what they mean, they tend even not to use the word tackling, they use the word dispossession.
right.
So you can dispossess someone if they lose control of the ball. So what we emphasize all the time is to pass to feet, because one of the main reasons you get running, and it happened to me this morning, someone you give the ball to someone and you set off into space for him to pass into space ahead of you,
Yeah,
and your natural tendency is then to set off after it too fast.
yeah,
Really, he's got to wait for me to get into space and then give me the ball to feet again. And what it does mean in terms of no tackling, the other thing you learn, unless it happens to be a competition where they play three touch, and most people don't, it is mostly unlimited touches, if you pass the ball to me
Yeah.
and I'm reasonable enough to keep control of it, I can shield the ball almost for as long as I want. I mean, the referees will clamp down if they think you're just holding on to the ball because you're wasting time.
Right.
Um, they will pull that up. But basically, the way to succeed is to pass to feet, and then either, as you say, to lose your marker, just to be a little bit quicker off the mark while still walking, or as you say, to feint one way, go the other way,
Yeah.
or if the opposition make a mistake and leave a person unmarked, then he's basically the person who should get the ball. But it does, yes, it does it does take a bit of learning, and every new player who comes to us of whatever age, those are the things they struggle with, really, the
Yeah.
running and the tackling. So you're allowed to block. I mean, if I'm facing a player, I will try and sort of cut off the angles which he can pass to
Yeah.
by attempting to make a block. That's allowable. But having said that about the Essex League, we are the only league I know about where there is really it's no tackling, which is all to protect play. It's a health and safety thing. I mean, we're playing in an over 70s league. This year, the Essex League are actually starting an over 75s league. So you don't want people crashing into each other, and you don't want people falling over and sending them to the ground and stuff.
Yeah.
They've got a responsibility. The refs have got a responsibility to look after you. So it does all take a bit of getting used to. But I have to say, I've played probably 6, 7 years now, and it's been terrific fun.
Brilliant. So part of me, Steve, I think my heart's telling me, oh, like walking football, brilliant. Couldn't think of anything better. Walking and just taking it easy. And then my head's telling me if I can't run about and crash into people, I don't know how well I'd get on. But you spoke earlier about the age restrictions, and then you've just added like the 70. So currently, like let's just say standard vets football now, you have an over 35s. I think there's an over 45s and an over 55s. What stats? So did you say walking football starts at 50 and then what you have
Yeah,
bands of 10 up or 5 up?
yeah. The Essex League, it tends to go up in fives. The Essex League is over 50s, which we've got two Orient teams in different divisions. Over 60s, we've now got a Tuesday team and a Saturday team. Over 65s, we've got two teams, and over 70s, the first time this season, we'll have two teams. So, as I'm the fixtures secretary, I should know, but I think it's 7 teams plus a women's team. We were tempted by the over 75s, but although it's only six aside, you normally pick a squad of eight. Um, and if we just got a couple of unavailable or a couple of injuries, we would struggle to make an over 75s. But we're all going up a year every year. And I think it won't be long till we have an over 75s. We once played a friendly against Barnet at the Hive,
Yeah.
and one of the Barnet players was celebrating his 84th birthday.
Wow.
So there's hope for us yet that we can go on a while. And I know how depressed one or two people get. We get one of our lads had a bad illness and bad injury, and has had to accept that he won't be able to play anymore. And just like anybody who has to give it up, you feel very sorry for them, and they feel very sorry for themselves.
Yeah.
So we just keep going as long as we can, really. It's interesting that you mentioned vets football. I mean, a lot of people do make that transition, having got to 50, they think maybe that's time to
Yeah.
slow down a bit. But if people can keep going for 55s or even more in vets football, I suspect they will. But they do tend to be the people who find it hardest to make the transition, as you
Sure.
can imagine yourself. I
Yeah.
know. I imagine vets football can be pretty full on, and the one thing that walking football doesn't want to be ideally is full on.
Yeah.
That's not the idea
Yeah.
of it. And so anybody coming in for the first time will find that transition quite difficult, I think.
No, I think it's brilliant, Steve. I think, as you said, the camaraderie, the staying fit, it's being part of a team. It's good mentally to get out and do something. Really, that's why I still play vets. Like I stopped playing non-league football. I think I was 36 and started playing vets and had 3 or 4 years off. But now, like I'm now I can now qualify for that over 45s, but I'm still hanging on in over 35s, and it's purely because like probably the same reasons that you're playing walking football, right? It's just gives me. I think I love football now. Well, I do love football more now than I did before. Than I had any commitment to it. You know, it's just nice to do something and still being active. And I think for me, my thing of playing is just while the fire's still burning, I think I'll play vets. But I think I'd definitely give walking football a go because I just love being around football.
Yeah,
And to your point, I probably would struggle with that. Not that I'm fast or anything these days, but I can still run around and I do like that physical contact. Whereas as you
yeah,
say, in walking football and there shouldn't be. Do you know what I mean? If you've got 84-year-old people playing,
yeah,
that's an amazing thing in itself. Let alone some 40-year-old crashing into them. But I think it's amazing. I think it's again, it's just a testament that football, right? Football's for everyone and different ages, different backgrounds. Just being part of the beautiful game, really. So I think that's brilliant. And before we close out, Steve, I know we had a little chat about it before, and we've talked about it before at Orient. Like, you go all over the world as well, right? Where you playing this year? Is it Mallorca this year and Tenerife? You going?
yes. What the thing about in Europe is that they have their own rules as well. And the thing we went to a Mallorca tournament 2 years running, tends to be May each year. And the strange thing about it, and this is apparently a Dutch thing, they play without goalkeepers.
Oh yeah.
So they're fairly small goals as well. I say to people, whoever was it who at a Dutch walking football meeting said, "Why don't we play without goalkeepers?" And everyone went, "Yeah, what a good idea." I mean, it's like saying, "Why don't we play cricket without wicket keepers or whatever?" Anyway, they play without goalkeepers. So all you do basically, you have a player, a defender, who just stands in front of the goal. And because there's no goalkeepers, there's no goal area. So he can just stand there and
Right.
effectively is a goalkeeper, but he's not allowed to use his hands.
The old Russian
Which,
Jack, Steve. Yeah.
yeah, yes. So he can come out as far as he wants and do what he wants, and occasionally a team will leave the goal completely empty and then lose possession and then concede the goal. Um, but it just seemed a very strange rule, and it was one of the things which slightly put us off going to this particular tournament. But I'm just literally, when I finish talking to you, I'm going to look up another one in the Algarve in May, which is somewhere I've played before, and is a very nicely organised tournament. They tend to be in very pleasant places, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
And the other one I've got I'm the fixtures, as I said, the fixtures secretary. So the other one I've got in my diary is in November. There's one in the Canaries, which sounds a very nice idea. Canaries at the start of November to me,
Yeah.
where our women's team actually went last year and said it was very enjoyable. So, like the spread of international walking football, all these tournaments are available, and we're very happy to welcome some of them over here, although the climate is less reliable. But it's well worth thinking about, and a very good, as with any other team going abroad. It's great for bonding and the social side of it, which we are allowed to enjoy a bit more than the professionals are these days.
Yeah. Well, I think that's what it's all about, Steve. Right? Having a tour and enjoying yourself, getting some sun on the back, and being with your mates. I think, yeah, even better. Amazing. As I say, it's great that you're still playing, and so I can hear the passion in your voice. And obviously, Orient have got great numbers doing that, which is good. So, as we close out, Steve, could you give us, don't know whether you as a fan or an ex BBC pundit, like what's your summary of the Orient? I know we chat a lot on our WhatsApp groups and stuff of the Orient Owl, but what would you say is your summary of Leighton Orient season so far?
Well, it's been fascinating in the sense that it so far it's mirrored last season, hasn't it? A very
Yeah,
difficult start, and then suddenly got the newer players integrated, um, and hit this terrific run. I don't hope that it's not coming to a premature end. We've had this huge boost of a big glamour cup tie, which we haven't had for so many years, with Manchester City coming up, which has enthused everybody as well.
yeah,
But I went down to Exeter this week, and the second time in all my 60 odd years of following Orient, only the second time I've seen us score 6 goals away from home. It was an extraordinary performance to go 4-0 up at half time, and you really thought. Uh, he's building something here, Richie
Yeah.
Wellens, and they bought two new. I know that the transfer policy has been criticised a bit because Orient can't afford to compete with the big spenders even in League One. But we've got two new wide players in, having had terrible injuries to the other wide players, both of whom look real prospects.
Yeah, really
Um,
good.
it's all good. The only trouble is with Leyton Orient and the history, and those of us who've been around it for a few years, you think surely it can't last. So there's this kind of slightly fatalistic thought about the whole thing. How long can it possibly last? I know there are even a few people who are thinking, well, actually, if we win the next game, we're in the playoff positions. Were we to get into the championship, are we quite ready? That would be a worry. But I'm sure should that happen, everyone will say, well, you've got to take the chance, haven't you? And let's just enjoy the ride. But no, it's been a very enjoyable season, and long may it continue.
Yeah, and I think just on that, like if little old Leighton Orient, I know Richie wants to change that tag, but if little old Leighton Orient got into the championship, I think that's something that you worry about when you get there, right? And just enjoy the ride for a year. I think for a club of our stature, what is there 10 ex Premier League clubs in our league now? For us to be even in the mix, especially after the start, is pretty good, right? And as I say, been mightily impressed with the two new boys. Great performance in the week. So, on that note, Steve, I really thank you for your time. You're just as I say, even on our WhatsApp group or around the pub or at the games or a massive fountain of knowledge. I really appreciate your time, and I look forward to catching up with you soon.
Yes, let's do that. Thanks ever so much. It's been great fun.
Cheers, Steve. All the best.